First of all, it's important to remember that in 1960, Lyndon Baines Johnson blackmailed his way onto the Kennedy ticket. In fact, at that point, candidate Senator John F. Kennedy had selected Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri to be his running mate. He had asked, Symington had accepted, and was writing his acceptance speech. And that night, Johnson and House Speaker Sam Rayburn showed up in Jack Kennedy's hotel room in Los Angeles late at night, and they had with them a dossier on Kennedy's sex life. This had been supplied to them by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was a next-door neighbor of Lyndon's. He was a close political ally. Between 1951 and 1961, the FBI budget had tripled due to the actions of Senate Majority Leader Johnson. When Lyndon stole his election in 1948 by 86 votes, J. Edgar Hoover flew down for the victory party at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin. So they were very close, and of course Hoover had his own motive. He knew he was facing mandatory retirement. He knew the Kennedys would put him out to pasture in 1964. In any event, Johnson's message for Kennedy was, you need me, you need Texas, and if you won't put me on the ticket, I'll just take this dossier and I'll give it to Dick Nixon. Now remember, Nixon and Kennedy were locked in a skin-tight race for president. So Kennedy demurs and he puts Lyndon on the ticket. The next morning, a reporter, in shock, asks the Senate Majority Leader, how could you give up one of the most powerful jobs in Washington, U.S. Senate Majority Leader, to be Vice President, a job that has no power at all? And Lyndon says, you know, I checked, and 1 in 4 Vice Presidents have become President of the United States upon the death of the President, and frankly, I'm a gambling man, and I like the odds. Maybe this is why Bobby Baker, who was the Secretary of the U.S. Senate, described by Lyndon as my right-hand man, quote-unquote, says at the 1961 inaugural of Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy will not live out his term and he will die a violent death. This is 3 years before the assassination. Johnson is marginalized by the Kennedys. He is cut out of the decision-making process. He goes from being one of the most powerful men in Washington to being the least powerful. He is sent out on the road for funerals and ceremonial meetings with foreign presidents that have no significance. He is cut out of the loop. In 1963, as the 1964 election approaches, Johnson is in desperate trouble. He is jammed up in 2 enormous scandals of the time. The Bobby Baker scandal. Baker was, as I said previously, the Secretary of the U.S. Senate. He is Johnson's bag man. He has collected millions of dollars in illegal bribes on behalf of Lyndon. He and Johnson are partners in numerous illegal enterprises. And the U.S. Senate has opened investigative hearings into Bobby Baker on November 22nd, 1963, the very day of the assassination. Lyndon's neck is on the line. He also knows that he's under investigation by the U.S. Justice Department in the matter of Billy Sol Estes. Sol Estes is a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer. He and Johnson have looted multi-millions of dollars from federal agricultural contracts that Johnson has delivered. Robert Kennedy has a full investigation. More importantly, Robert, who wants Johnson off the 64 ticket, has leaked this information to Time Life. And Life magazine has 9 investigative reporters on the ground, a veritable hit team digging into Johnson's background for a December 1st expose issue, an issue that will bring Lyndon federal prosecution and prison. So it's not just being dumped from the 64 ticket, although President Jack Kennedy tells his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, according to her memoirs, on the eve of leaving for Dallas, he says, Johnson will be off the 64 ticket, quote, I don't know who it will be, but it will not be Lyndon. He goes on to say that he is considering North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford, a Southern racial moderate. So Johnson is a man staring into the abyss. He can either become President of the United States or he can go to the federal penitentiary. Therein lies his motive. Now, finding co-plotters is not all that difficult. Lyndon is the appropriator for the CIA. Johnson sits on the secret subcommittee that passes the black box budgets, which are hidden in our aerospace budgets. The CIA cannot function without the hundreds of millions of dollars being delivered by Lyndon. No defense contract in Washington moves without a bribe for Lyndon. When he leaves the Senate to become vice president, he helps install Senator Harry F. Byrd, a close Johnson ally, in the congressional oversight that oversees the programs of the CIA. And then there's organized crime. Their motive? They gave $1 million to John Kennedy. They stole votes. They intimidated voters for him in Chicago, West Virginia, and in Texas. And in return, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, Kennedy's father, who was a gangster himself, a partner of Frank Costello, the notorious New York mobster, essentially importing scotch by boat into Cape Cod, trucking it down to New York and sell it, which I think is called bootlegging. He promises the mob boys for a $1 million contribution and a little help on Election Day that the 2 gangsters, Santo Trafficante Jr., who runs runs the mob in Florida, and Carlos Marcello, who runs the mob in Texas and Louisiana, will not be deported. There are slow-moving deportation processes that have begun under Eisenhower that the mobsters are very concerned about. Robert Kennedy becomes the Attorney General. He double-crosses the mob. He puts wiretaps on Marcello and Trafficante. He harasses them. He actually kidnaps Marcello, flies him to Guatemala where he has a phony passport, and dumps him in the jungle wearing nothing but his Brioni suit and his Gucci shoes. Needless to say, Marcello is not happy. Indeed, government wiretaps uncovered by the House Select Committee on Assassinations pick up both Trafficante and Marcello talking about the fact that Kennedy would be killed prior to his murder and taking credit in the case of Senator Trafficante after his murder. Lyndon's relationship with the mob? Why, Carlos Marcello is one of his biggest financial supporters. Lyndon takes a $55,000 a year bribe from the mob to protect their illegal gambling operations from the U.S. attorneys in Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. Indeed, within 24 hours of Johnson becoming president, the wiretaps put on organized crime by Attorney General Robert Kennedy are terminated by order of the President of the United States. And then there's Big Texas Oil. They are apoplectic because Kennedy is talking about repealing the oil depletion allowance. The oil depletion allowance is a sweetheart tax break that Texas right-wing billionaire oil men are receiving. And by the way, it's still in place today, is yet to be repealed. But it will cost the Texas oil men hundreds of millions of dollars in additional federal taxes. And who has been the water carrier in Washington for the oil depletion allowance in the U.S. Senate? That would be Vice President Johnson. Everyone involved in this plot has their own motive. The CIA is upset about the Bay of Pigs invasion in which President Kennedy failed to order air support for the Cuban rebels storming the shores of Cuba. Hundreds of men are arrested, hundreds more are killed. It's a fiasco. They're also upset about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you'll find books that tell you how Jack Kennedy faced the Russians down, they blinked, and they removed our missiles from Cuba. And it was the closest this nation and this world has ever come to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. The problem with that is, it's not true. 40 years later, we learned that the Kennedy brothers gave up U.S. missiles in Turkey and Italy, changing the balance of power in the European theater. And that fact was kept from the American people for 40 years. If Ronald Reagan did that, they would have impeached him. But that secret was kept from us. The generals knew it, the Pentagon knew it, the CIA knew it, and they were unhappy. Why? Nikita Khrushchev took Jack Kennedy to the cleaners in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was no on-site inspection in our deal with Khrushchev. Kennedy asked for it. Khrushchev refused. No American, no third party ever confirmed that the missiles left Cuba. That's a sorry fact. So the CIA has their motives. The mob has their motives. Texas Oil has their motives. And indeed, Lyndon Johnson has a unique relationship with all of them. This is a president who conducted White House meetings while sitting on the toilet defecating. Not because he was crude, but because he enjoyed the humiliation and embarrassment it caused these Ivy League aides that he had inherited from Jack Kennedy. Life magazine finds in 1963, despite the fact that he's only been a high school teacher, a congressman, and a U.S. senator, and he's been on the public payroll his entire life, he is worth $25 million. Today, that would be $150 million. How's the standard bribe work? It's very simple. You want a piece of legislation? You want a contract? You buy fake advertising at Johnson's radio station that he owns in Austin. The advertising never runs, but that's where you pay your bribe. Johnson enters public service penniless, and he leaves a multi-millionaire. 1951, Sam Southwick, a man who is a party to the theft of the 1948 election, where after the polls, 200 voters march into a polling place in alphabetical order, and they all sign in the same handwriting with the same ink. That's what happened in Jim Wells County. And when Sam Southwick, a deputy sheriff, threatened to go to the U.S. attorney and give testimony against Lyndon Johnson, he was murdered in the state prison within hours. Now let's talk about the mechanics. I put forward a case based on fingerprint evidence and eyewitness testimony. At least one of the shooters is a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace. Mac Wallace is a Marine expert shot. A marksman is a poor shot. A sharpshooter is a B, and the A rating, the best rating that the Marine Corps awards, is expert. Oswald was a marksman. Malcolm Wallace was an expert. Wallace was the president of the student body at the University of Texas, and from that point on, every job he has is a political patronage job arranged for by Lyndon. In 1951, a man named John Douglas Kinzer gets intimately involved with Lyndon's sister, Josepha. Josepha is a bohemian party girl, and sometimes call girl, who works at Miss Polly's in Austin, a very famous whorehouse of the time. Kinzer puts the bite on Johnson for money, essentially blackmailing him. Josepha has been deeply involved in the campaign of 1948. She knows how it was stolen. Wallace drives from Washington, D.C. to Austin. He finds John Douglas Kinzer at a golf course outside of Austin. He guns him down in cold blood in broad daylight in front front of witnesses. He flees. When he is apprehended minutes later, because he has Virginia license plates, by the Austin police, he tells the arresting officer, "You can't arrest me. I have to get back to Washington. I work for Senator Johnson." He is charged with first-degree murder. He is bailed out by two of Lyndon's largest financial contributors. He is defended at trial by John Cofer, Lyndon's personal attorney. Johnson holds up in a hotel room near the courthouse waiting for word. And Malcolm Wallace is convicted of first-degree murder, whereupon the judge gives him a 5-year suspended sentence, and he walks out of the court a free man. Now, I checked. In 1952, every other person convicted of first-degree murder in Texas went to the electric chair. But instead, Mac Wallace went to work immediately for a company called Temco. Temco is a defense contractor owned by a man named H.D. Byrd. Byrd is a major financial donor of Lyndon's. He's also the man who owns the Texas School Book Depository building. Wallace leaves a fingerprint in the 6th-floor sniper's nest in the Texas School Book Depository. It's a 34-point match fingerprint. It only requires a 7-point match to be admissible in the U.S. federal courts. So now we have fingerprint evidence that ties Lyndon's personal hitman to the room from which the shot at the president was allegedly fired. We also have 6 witnesses who tell either the FBI, the Dallas Police Department, or the Warren Commission that they saw movement in the 6th-floor windows just prior to the shooting. In fact, 3 of the 6 tell the authorities that they saw 2 men, and they describe a man who is heavy-set, balding, and wearing glasses. That's Malcolm Wallace. One man, Richard Carr, tells the FBI that he not only saw a man meeting Wallace's description in the window, but he also saw the same man running out of the building after the shooting, jump in a late-model Rambler, and drive away. That was a major mistake on Richard Carr's part, because between 1963 and 1978, there are no less than 4 attempts on Mr. Carr's life. Somebody tries to shoot him in Texas. He moves to Montana. Somebody tries to shoot him in Montana. Then somebody tries to bomb his car in Montana. Then he moves back to Washington, D.C., but when he gets a subpoena from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, as late as 1978, when he goes to Washington, 2 men try to gun him down in the street in D.C. What did Mr. Carr see that is so important? He saw LBJ's hitman leave the building. Lee Harvey Oswald weighs 135 pounds and he's 26 years old. But 3 witnesses describe a man who is middle-aged, heavy-set, balding, and wearing glasses. Indeed, horn-rimmed glasses, 2 out of the 3 say. So, now you have eyewitness testimony and a fingerprint that tie Lyndon Johnson. So you may say to me, where is Lee Harvey Oswald? Where is he? He's on the 2nd floor where he said he was. The Warren Commission says that a Dallas police officer finds him 75 minutes after the last shot. They ask us to believe that Oswald had time to hide a rifle and run down 4 flights of stairs because the elevator's cut off as the electricity is down in the building. Indeed, Vicki Butler says that she was on the stairs at that crucial time, and she saw, and more importantly, heard no Lee Harvey Oswald, because it's a wooden staircase built in the 20s, and if anyone were on it, one would hear that. So, it explains why Oswald, when he's approached by a police officer, is nonplussed. He's not emotional. He's sipping on a Coca-Cola. That's because he's on the 2nd floor eating his lunch. Now, who else says that Lyndon is involved? Well, Jackie Kennedy, she's never satisfied with what she's being told by Warren. She goes to French intelligence and asks them. They conduct a full investigation, and they publish it. What do they conclude? Lyndon Johnson is the perp. There's a declassified memo in 1996 from J. Edgar Hoover to President Johnson, letting him know that an American spy has reported that the Soviet KGB has conducted their extensive investigation. And what do they conclude? Lyndon Johnson is the key figure in the murder of John Kennedy. E. Howard Hunt, a CIA operative throughout his career, says on his deathbed, okay, I was in Dallas that day. I was low level. But he also says Lyndon was running the show. Jack Ruby's never allowed to speak to reporters. The Warren Commission tells us Ruby had no known associations with organized crime. That's a laughable joke. Carlos Marcello owns Ruby's club. Ruby is fronting in the Carousel Club for Marcello. He had a criminal record of working for Al Capone when he lived in Chicago as Jacob Rubenstein. He is a button man for the mob. The Warren Commission asks you to believe that he had no known connections, that he merely felt bad about Mrs. Kennedy's plight. Senator Barry Goldwater, Robert and Jackie Kennedy, they knew it was Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy sends an emissary, William Walton, who's a friend of Jacqueline Kennedy's, to the Soviet Union, where he has cultural relationships. He meets with the KGB and he gives them a message from the Kennedys. 1, they say, we know that John Kennedy was killed by a domestic conspiracy, meaning the Russians had nothing to do with it. 2, Dallas was the perfect place for the crime. And 3, the elevation of Lyndon is unfortunate. Robert Kennedy tells his assistant Walter Sheridan, I know exactly what happened, but there's nothing I can do about it now. Which is true, because despite the fact he still has the title of Attorney General, the power has shifted to Lyndon. So who is Bobby going to go to? The FBI? They're conducting the cover-up. In 1963, murder is not a federal crime, it is a state crime. And therefore the investigation will be conducted by the Dallas Police Department, the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, and the Dallas County District Attorney. Cliff Carter calls from Air Force One to Henry Wade, the District Attorney, and says, you are to indict Oswald for murder, a state crime, but not conspiracy, a federal crime. Johnson wants no federal investigation. And it's very simple why the Warren Commission, these learned men, these congressmen, senators, the Supreme Court justice, do what they do. Because Lyndon tells them all the same thing. The Russians did it. The American people will demand retribution. We're talking about nuclear war, World War III, millions will die. Justice Warren, you must help me button this up for the good of the people. Do it for your country. Barlow Inspector is merely doing what the Chief Justice and Allen Dulles, the former CIA director on the Warren Commission, are telling him to do, which is create the fiction of the single bullet theory that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. That's nonsense. His background as a communist is fabricated, and that he acted alone. There are potential plots planned for Chicago and also for Tampa that are banded for various mechanical reasons. Oswald was a patsy. He's a fall guy. The CIA has maneuvered him there. We don't know what he's been told. We're going to have a simulated attempt on the president's life. It's a drill. Or you're there as part of an abort team. We believe there'll be an attempt on the president's life. We have no idea what Oswald has been told. We do know this. They keep telling us that he killed Officer Tippit. Really? Well, how come the guns from the bullet that killed Tippit don't match the revolver that Oswald is arrested with in the theater? Tippit's killed with an automatic, and Oswald's holding a revolver when he's arrested. The FBI report says, you can read it in the Warren Commission, they can't match the bullets. The government relies on one witness who says they saw Oswald kill Tippit. There are multiple other witnesses who contradict that, and they are systematically ignored by the Warren Commission. So I suspect that Tippit was on his way to kill Oswald. Voice stress technology that wasn't available in 1963 that is available today, when you test the statements of Lee Harvey Oswald, such as, I didn't kill anyone, I'm a patsy, that test is true. Reporter yells, did you shoot the President of the United States? He says, no, sir, I did not. That test is true. Members of the Warren Commission don't believe their own report. We know from a taped telephone call between Senator Richard Russell and President Johnson on the day that the Warren Commission report is released, and Russell says, I don't believe a word of it, and Johnson says, either do I. Yet Johnson goes on an interview with Walter Cronkite and says there was an international conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. The truth is that Kennedy has done two things to enrage the military-industrial complex. He has concluded that Vietnam is a disaster, and he has signed an executive order to begin the withdrawal of our 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. The Monday after he becomes president, Lyndon Johnson signs a new executive order reversing that, giving the generals and the defense contractors the war they want. Now, the Kennedy assassination is not about Vietnam as much as it's about Cuba policy. The CIA proposes something called Operations Northwoods. The American military killing Americans, blaming it on the Cubans as a false flag to create a pretext to invade Cuba. Kennedy vetoes this plan. Ambassador William Atwood, who was a roommate of JFK's at Princeton, has gone to Castro and said John Kennedy would like to have quiet back-channel talks. And Castro's surprised, but he agrees. And this is supposed to be kept secret from the CIA, but I suspect they know it. It is Lyndon Johnson who insists that Kennedy come to Dallas. Indeed, Kennedy tells Senator George Smather, the Florida senator, in his memoirs, 3 days before coming here, he's going to Texas at Johnson's insistence, and he dreads it. It is John Connally, the governor of Texas, who insists on the actual little drive through Dealey Plaza. And when the Kennedy advance men, notably Jerry Bruno, JFK's chief advancement, doesn't like the route because the 120-degree turn into Dealey Plaza requires the car to come to an almost complete halt, which puts the chief executive in danger, he's overruled by Connally, who says, you tell the president. He does it our way, or the invitation is rescinded and we don't want him. Now, some people say, why would Lyndon put his protege in the death car with John Kennedy, where indeed he gets shot? And the answer is, the morning of the assassination, Lyndon goes to the hotel room of Kennedy and says, I've got a great idea. Let's have Connally ride in my car, and we'll have Senator Ralph Yarborough, his arch rival in Democratic politics, ride with the president. And JFK says no. They have a shouting match, and Johnson storms away. How do we know this? Jackie Kennedy has written about it. So it is clear that Johnson creates the opportunity to kill Kennedy. The CIA and the mob have worked together seamlessly in the efforts to assassinate Castro. This is not a new partnership. Frank Mankiewicz, who was Robert Kennedy's press secretary, confirms that 4 days before his murder in California, Robert Kennedy told a student audience that he would reopen the investigation into the murder of his brother. And that sent chills through those who had been involved. There is some evidence that the Los Angeles Police Department botches this investigation. I think there may also be multiple gunmen. Carter Burden was a very very well-known aristocratic Democrat in New York, came from a very wealthy family, ran for Congress, was a major socialite. He was a very close friend of Jacqueline Kennedy's. In the afternoon in which Robert Kennedy is shot, she calls Carter Burden and she says, "They got Bobby too. They got Bobby too." Dr. Martin Luther King is picked up in an FBI wiretap shortly before his murder, telling an associate that he's going to endorse Robert Kennedy for president in 1968. Johnson knows the pivotal role that King has played in 1960, where he basically tipped the election from Nixon to John Kennedy in a skin-tight race. So I suspect that that is also a factor in his murders. Immediately after the murder, J. Edgar Hoover, within days, issues his report, which says Lee Harvey Oswald, he's a communist, he acted alone, he's a lone nut, he fired 3 shots, all from behind, case closed, rubber stamp it. And the Warren Commission is preparing to rubber stamp it. The problem is that there's a man named James Tague, who was 39 years old in 1963. He's about 80 today. And Mr. Tague is in Dealey Plaza. He gets stuck in traffic, so he abandons his car. He walks to a place where he can see the motorcade go by. He sees Kennedy murdered. And while he's standing there, a bullet hits a curb next to him, and either a fleck of bullet or cement bounces up and cuts his cheek. A Dallas Sheriff's Office deputy sees this, comes up to him and says, "Hey, what happened to your face?" Tague realizes he's bleeding. He's also just seen John Kennedy's head explode. So he's in shock, but they take him down to the police station. He files a report. Then he hears nothing more about this shot. A reporter named Jim Lear, later famous at PBS, writes a wire story about the uncounted shot. For 3 weeks, J. Edgar Hoover tries to say there was no shot, but the U.S. attorney in Texas has already cut out the piece of the curb and has the evidence. So now Arlen Specter has a giant problem, and therefore is born the single bullet theory. The first shot hits the curb, the second shot hits Kennedy and Connally, the third shot hits Kennedy, case closed. Nonsense. Kennedy's hit from the front the first time. There are multiple shooters, without question. You can't get off 3 shots in 6.5 seconds with this Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The Army couldn't duplicate it. CBS couldn't duplicate it. Nobody could duplicate it. The rifle is not even properly sighted. The government goes through huge gyrations to say he was shot simply from behind. 13 doctors and nurses at Parkland say they see a hole in the back of his head the size of a grapefruit. And later on, the government produces an x-ray that shows his head is entirely intact. Dan Rather is shown the Zapruder film, and he comes out and he lies. He says, the president lurched violently forward. For what reason? You'd have to ask him. Lee Harvey Oswald's given a paraffin test. There's no nitrogen on his face or his hands or his arms. He hasn't fired a rifle that day. The Dallas Police Department reports say that there are 2 shell casings. Somewhere along the way, the Warren Commission changes that to 3. The police officer says he scratched his initials in both, but the shells that the Warren Commission has no initials. Somebody plants a pristine bullet on the stretcher that carried John Connally, went through Jack Kennedy and Connally, and remained pristine. Yet the government can't duplicate that either, despite their best tries. Lady Bird was a shrewd investor. She had big stock in Bell Helicopter. She had big stake in Brown and Root, which you may know today as Halliburton. The Johnsons' estate made millions on the Vietnam War. We do know there was a $325 million contract given to Brown and Root to dredge Cameron Bay, which didn't need dredging. No, I think the generals wanted their war. The defense contractors wanted their war. H.D. Byrd, 3 months after Johnson becomes president, they get an enormous multi-million-dollar contract for the Vietnam War. That company today is known as LTV. So they get their reward for housing Malcolm Wallace after the assassination. Wallace, by the way, dies in 1971 when someone rigs up his truck to fill with exhaust fumes and he drives off the road and hits an embankment. Gerald Ford, as a congressman and a member of the Warren Commission, falsified the autopsy records, moving the description of the wound from Kennedy's upper back to his lower neck to accommodate the wound in the front of his throat as an exit wound and thus expedite the government's single bullet theory. The reason that Ford pardons Nixon is because if Nixon had gone to trial in Watergate, he was taking everybody down. He was going to reveal the CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination, and you, Jerry, you covered up the autopsy for the Warren Commission, which Americans didn't learn until 1996, after Nixon was dead.
For some time they were saying Castro killed Kennedy, and I think the current vogue now for the agency is to publish books saying the mob, and all these ridiculous things, when any thinking person can look at the facts and see clearly that the main conflict was between Jack Kennedy and the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, it was on the front page of the New York Times in 1963, the split between the 2 of them. It came to a point where Jack Kennedy said, I'm going to tear the agency into 1,000 pieces. It just happened the agency tore him before he got a chance. Within 72 hours of John Kennedy's death, right after the eulogy in the rotunda, Lyndon Johnson crossed over to the old office building and met with the ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Lodge, and said, in effect, you can go back and tell the Vietnamese now that we're going to back them all the way. No position papers, no 6-week, too-much studies by the military and intelligence. Within a few days, he was meeting with the Lodge and telling him, we are changing the policy in the Far East 180 degrees. He reversed Kennedy's policy, and in 18 months, he was pouring 500,000 American soldiers in there, an expeditionary force. For no reason, we were not even invited by South Vietnam. And of course, not only did we lose 55,000 fine young men, but we got in a war which was not supported by the people, but was kept alive nevertheless successively by Johnson and then by Nixon, to the point where in riots in Washington, D.C., they had to arrest 20,000 American citizens protesting the war. By those Nazi methods, they managed to make a war nobody wanted last 9 years. But with Kennedy, we would not have had the war because he said most specifically on the 2nd of October, 1963, he told Kenny O'Donnell, we're getting out of Vietnam. We will be completely out by 1965. That means the helicopters and everything. Incidentally, when he said that, even then we did not have a single combat soldier in Vietnam. The first order he gave was to return 1,000 of our troops by the end of December 1963. But that was countermanded within 24 hours of his death, which gives you some idea of how much backing he had from his own government. The Bay of Pigs was inherited from the previous administration. The main designer and supervisor of the Bay of Pigs, Richard Nixon, who later, when he got back in office, helped keep the Vietnam War going. He was one of the cold warriors, but that was not Kennedy's policy. His position was, I don't have much alternative. People think that I'm failing to follow up on the previous president if I don't go ahead with something that he's initiated, but he was not very enthusiastic about it. The invasion of the Bay of Pigs of Cuba was being accomplished by anti-Castro Cubans, trained and backed, of course, by American advisors, by the CIA project that was insufficiently backed, and this agency thought that it could jam Jack Kennedy into bringing in the Navy fighter planes, which were just over the horizon on the Navy flat tops. Their engines were even warmed up, so they were obviously intended to be used. So when the man in charge of the Bay of Pigs, General Charles Cabell, who just by a strange coincidence happened to be the brother of Mayor Earl Cabell, in whose town Jack Kennedy was murdered a year or two later, when General Cabell called on President Kennedy to make the Navy planes available, Kennedy said, absolutely not. The reason the Russians put the missiles in there was they wanted to discourage any further American adventurism or landing in Cuba. Whichever view you take, the crisis was laid upon us by those missiles, and Kennedy's view was we had to get those missiles out of there. But the approach recommended to him by the military and our intelligence advisors was to bomb and invade Cuba. Kennedy's solution was the blockade, and the Russians ended up pulling out their missiles. The reaction of the anti-Castro individuals who were being trained north of Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans had come to hate John Kennedy for what they regarded as failure to back them up when he agreed with Khrushchev not to invade Cuba again. Even worse, they were continuing to violate the president's specific order, and they were training daily for the ultimate invasion of Cuba. They had a cover name called Operation Mongoose. On the surface, it looked like a legitimate series of forays against Cuba, ostensibly in the national interest, but if you look at the actual description in the 1961 memorandum of Operation Mongoose as described by Major General Lansdale, who'd spent years keeping the Vietnam War going, it was clear that he had in mind the ultimate invasion of Cuba and nothing less. Guy Bannister, former special agent in charge of the Chicago office, by 1963 was working for the Central Intelligence Agency. His right-hand man was David Ferry, who comes into the story later, but Bannister was operating this anti-Castro movement, which was completely in opposition to everything that Kennedy was talking about. That's how New Orleans comes into it. Sometimes people say, why you, as if I brought New Orleans into it. And the answer, of course, if I was DA of Pittsburgh, it wouldn't have been me. But I was DA of New Orleans, and New Orleans is where they were setting up this next invasion of Cuba. Every day or so, a day ferry would drive from Bannister's office across the lake, check the training, which consisted largely of shooting, come back and give his report, and it was moving forward pretty steadily until August 1st, 1963. Kennedy learned that for several years now, his orders against any more anti-Cuba activity was being violated. So he had to call on the FBI to actually raid the CIA camp where the Cubans were being trained. But because the intelligence community protects different parts of each other, the FBI did not make it public to the people until we were able to find out the troops were being trained there, too, to land in Cuba. But they broke it up for the time being. I'm not sure that made a lot of difference since this was August 1st, 63. By then, a lot of men had been trained and were available to do some shooting when November came in Dallas. The Kennedy thing was not using just CIA individuals. It was going off the shelf, taking some civilian groups and other groups, building up by 63 a force from which you had the central ingredients that actually murdered John Kennedy. But the covert elements of the CIA, that's what I want to emphasize. But that was indeed the predecessor of the Iran-Contra business. It was the grandfather of that and the others which followed. I think Casey had in mind setting up a series of off-the-shelf operations, and probably wasn't the first one the North was involved in. Since I was in the city and happened to be DA and had the responsibility of seeing what Lee Oswald was doing this summer of 63, I went down to 544 camp to look at it and see what it was. And I took one look and I said, hell, this is a side entrance to Guy Bannister's office. I knew Guy. He used to be head of the Chicago FBI office, and during World War II, he was in the Office of Naval Intelligence. Ostensibly, communist material has stamped on it an address 544 camp, which is the location of the intelligence community in New Orleans, meaning there's prima facie evidence that Lee Oswald was not a communist at all. He was an agent provocateur. We later found out that on the third floor of Bannister's office, he located a small room and cleaned it out and gave it to Oswald to keep his pamphlets in. So he goes out and hands them out like he's a communist, but he's the one that calls the news people to come take the pictures, and he's acting out a role as a communist, but he doesn't know he's the scapegoat. They're going to have him murdered. Before the assassination, when I was district attorney, Shep Morrison, the mayor of New Orleans, said, we have a man named Bannister. Looks like he might be a good assistant superintendent of police for that vacancy. And I didn't know much about him, but I said, if he's got a good FBI background, he's organized and sounds good to me. After spending some nights with the Warren Commission, I had put aside the address 544 camp to check because I saw that Lee Oswald was putting that stamp on papers. He only did it one day and they stopped him. They kind of had a heart attack, I'm sure, when he was putting that on the papers he was handing out to the public. But he didn't know that he was set to be the scapegoat, so he was doing what he thought was natural. When he was arrested on August 9th and brought to the 1st District, first thing he did was ask to speak to an FBI agent. And FBI agent Quigley came over very promptly. Quigley and Oswald were locked in a private conference for some time. It was a setup controversy with other Cubans, just to make it look like he was a troublemaker for the communists. It resolved in those particular pamphlets becoming available to the eye, though, and ultimately available to me. So I put them on the side to check, and then a few nights later I came across in the Warren Commission report Colonel Folsom's 201 personnel file of Lee Oswald and the Marines, and he casually mentioned, and here's Lee Oswald's grades in a Russian test. Somebody must have kicked him under the table because he said he didn't do too well. He got almost as many right as he got wrong, but I wouldn't get any right in a Russian test. With all my years in the military, and I was a major by then, I never took a Russian test. He was a private taking a Russian examination. I realized then that there were signs of intelligence training of Oswald not long before he left for Russia. So obviously, in retrospect, he didn't leave as a communist. He left as a young Marine with an intelligence assignment. Otherwise, the Marines wouldn't be teaching him Russian. But I wanted to see what this, quote, Russian-studying Marine was operating out of, and that's what caused me to go down that weekend morning to Lafayette Square and look at 544 Camp Street. That address was a side entrance to Guy Bannister's office. Around the corner on Lafayette Street was the entrance to Bannister's office. Across the street in the post office building was an Office of Naval Intelligence. Bannister was Naval Intelligence in World War II. I knew some of these people. As district attorney in New Orleans, I knew the Secret Service was also across the street. Around the corner, just across Lafayette Square, was the office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and also on another floor, the office of the Central Intelligence Agency. This lone assassin was a Marine soldier doing what he was taught to do after he was given intelligence training, operating right out of the heart of the intelligence community. The reason the heart is located there so close to the riverfront is that's where all the ships go from New Orleans down to Central and South America. And a lot of the members of the ships are intelligence men, too. Nobody was in Bannister's office who was not intelligence. Earlier in the summer, he was working around the corner at the Riley Coffee Company. Didn't have that much to do, so he spent most of his time at the Alba garage next door, which happened to be the garage for the intelligence community. It didn't even accept civilian automobile. It was filled up with the intelligence community. And then when August came, he was handing out the pamphlets. I was wondering, how did the U.S. intelligence community handle his co-workers so that they wouldn't be telling too many people? So I sent my chief investigator over there, and he was back in an hour and a half with a list. And every man that had been working with Oswald or above him at the Riley Coffee Company had, within 2 weeks, been moved out to a higher-paying job out at NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Branyan had gone to Chrysler. This man had gone to Boeing. This man was working for NASA itself. Another man was working for NASA. The same thing happened to anybody who helped in the assassination. We had a Sunday meeting to review the whole thing. Kennedy's body's still warm. And we were looking for somebody who was associated with Lee Oswald. We found that David Ferry was with him frequently. We had a rejected complaint because it was such a minor case, but it had his address on it. We went over to Dave Ferry's house, and we found several friends of his waiting there for him, and they admitted he'd gone to Texas. I noticed a map of Cuba on the wall, all kinds of rifles, all kinds of military equipment, and I realized I wasn't dealing with Joe Smith American. We waited for him to come back, and when he came back on Monday morning, I had him arrested, brought to my office, and said, what was your reason for going into Texas this strange time? And he explained he hadn't been ice skating in years and was seized with the urge to go ice skating. So I said, well, that's very interesting, but how did you happen to pick the heaviest storm in many years to drive to? Well, he couldn't think of an answer to that, so we arrested David Ferry within 72 hours of the assassination. I had him taken over to the 1st District to be held for the FBI for investigation. You couldn't give these guys. I'm trying to give these guys, the assassins, the people who set him up for the case, and they dropped Ferry like a hot potato. They even made a public announcement that it was not the FBI's idea to arrest Mr. Ferry, but it was Jim Garrison's. To make a long story short, we got the right guy, and as the House committee, although it didn't do a very effective job, it did conclude that there was a conspiracy. 10 years later, went on to say one of the signs that a conspiracy existed was Lee Oswald's association with David Ferry. That's what I was trying to say 10 years earlier. But then it went on to say, but now it was too late to look into. The reason given for the supposed involvement of organized crime is so that they could get rid of the Attorney General. This idea was conceived and is spread consistently by the Central Intelligence Agency so that you will look away from its covert operations and its other murders. If you want to get rid of the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, all you have to do at the time is shoot him when he goes to his Justice Department office in the morning or on the way out in the afternoon, because he didn't even have a bodyguard. All he had was a driver who was also the bodyguard. Now compare that to getting rid of him in the way that the agency wants you to believe, the mafia. They say, you've got to give the mob credit for having more sense than this. To have to penetrate the huge guard around the President of the United States, the Secret Service protection, the FBI protection, all the other agencies, the protection of the police in the city, in order ultimately to cause his Attorney General to end up without a job is really not very logical. But let's take another step further. One of the most critical steps in accomplishing the murder was the change of the parade route at the last second. On the morning of the parade, the Dallas Morning News showed that the parade route for the president was to continue on Main Street all the way through Dealey Plaza. That map was 5-6, leaving just one column on the left of the front page, so everybody could see the route of the president. Now, what actually happened was when the presidential motorcade came and reached Dealey Plaza, without warning, it turned right down Houston and left into Elm. It was a cul-de-sac where the ambush was waiting, and secondly, that double turn, the last leg of which was 120 degrees to the left, slowed his vehicle down to 10 miles an hour, where you could hit him with a rock. If he had been going 25 miles an hour out in the meadow as planned through the center of Dealey Plaza on Main, they would have been able to hit the side of the car with it. But anyway, that's what happened. The parade was changed at the last moment. The parade of the President of the United States. I ask you, who has the most power to change the route of the President of the United States at the last minute? A big tuna Artardo or the security portions of the United States government designed to protect? That's not all. The Secret Service itself participated in the hijacking over the verbal, vocal protests of the Dallas officials because the autopsy is required under Texas law to be held in Dallas for reasons like this. To keep an autopsy from being done in another state under strange controls. Anyway, the body of John Kennedy was whisked out by Air Force One federal personnel, and they got it into a military hospital in Bethesda. Now, in that military autopsy, there were 30 men approximately, most in uniforms, almost all military officers of high rank, except for one of the pathologists who was a civilian. The other two pathologists were military, and there were several FBI agents and several Secret Service. So you have entirely federal people. It was so badly rigged that the members of the Warren Commission could not look at it. They put their hands over their eyes, and just to also save them from being embarrassed, the autopsy papers and the x-rays were not even presented to them. They never saw them. And furthermore, the chief pathologist on that Sunday weekend burned the original autopsy in his fireplace. So there you have a rigged autopsy. Now, what room was there for a member of the mob to be participating? That's my reply to people who think the mob was involved. Bannister's beating of Jack Martin. The police report is dated 22nd of November, 1963, the night of the assassination. The reason Bannister beat Jack Martin that night was Bannister, because probably not unrelated to his years as head of the FBI in Chicago. While he was capable of drinking heavily at night, he was sober as a judge during the day. But on the day of the assassination, Bannister, for the first time to anybody's memory, got completely drunk. He was with Jack Martin, who worked for him on the afternoon of the assassination. Jack Martin did the detective work, and the office had on the front of it, Guy Bannister, private detective. But all Guy Bannister did all day was work on the logistics and the problems of getting additional ammunition to Cuba for the CIA, but Jack Martin did his detective work. So they were friends, even though they were vitally different personalities. But they'd both been drinking at nightfall, and they were on the way home from the Catch and Jammer bar on Camp Street around the corner of Lafayette Street to Guy Bannister's office. Somewhere on the way upstairs, on the second floor where the office was, Bannister said to Jack that he'd been looking into his filing cases. Well, of course, Bannister was very careful about his filing cases because there was nothing in there but intelligence. As we later learned, there were no private cases at all. But Jack Martin, nevertheless, was a thoroughly honest man, and he was outraged, and he replied, "Look, I saw some certain people coming in and out of your office all summer long, and I can say something about that if I want to." And at that point, Bannister, who did not carry regular sidearm, carried a .357 Magnum. He pistol-whipped Martin until they had to get an ambulance over to cart the body away. Oswald was arrested at 3 o'clock Dallas time, and this is roughly 5:45 or 6 New Orleans time, and already someone who Bannister knows has called his attention that he hasn't forgotten seeing Lee Oswald in and out of that office. So that's why he blew up. The role of David Ferry was essentially the right-hand man of Bannister. We knew he was associated with Lee Oswald because we got so many witnesses. And ultimately, at Bannister's, it said when he wasn't meeting with Guy Bannister, he was talking with Ferry. Always. The kid was always, they called him the kid. And his role was the liaison man, the extension. Bannister was like the commander of the battalion, had too much to do to leave headquarters. Apparently, that was related to Ferry's function rolling right into Texas on the day of the assassination. Since he knew so many of the Cuban shooters had been training north of the lake, and he knew the kid, you can see if many men were worried about Oswald talking while he was alive until they could get to him and kill him. Think of the value of a familiar voice like Dave Ferry calling from Dallas, where it can be trained, saying, "Lee, thank God I got you on the phone. I'm here in Dallas. We want to reassure you everything is great. You've done a beautiful job. Just keep cool. Everything's working. You're going to be a hero." He was trying to tell, and he made no secrets about it. He said he was scared to death of some members of the sheriff's office he didn't identify. But as he told Warren, Ford was present too. He said, "If you would just get me out of here, I'll tell you about the biggest conspiracy you ever heard of, but I can't do it here." And about that time, somebody looked at their watch and said, "Well, it's time for lunch." Literally. The people in Washington weren't crazy about that idea because they didn't want to know any more than they knew. The world's leading experts attempted to duplicate the feat with Oswald's rifle. They could not even begin to duplicate the feat. But even more than that Mannlicher Carcano was so bad that it was predictable. Before the experts could hit the side of a barn, they had to have the sight adjusted. The sight was loose and not adjusted, and when you looked through the sight, you weren't looking down the same line as the tube. But moreover, the final, most tragic thing of all, Lee Oswald was exonerated from firing a rifle on the evening of the assassination. The nitrate test showed he hadn't fired a rifle at all. It took 8 months before the rest of America found out that Oswald had not fired a rifle because it was in the small print of the Warren Report. He was working with the FBI. Nobody from the FBI has told us. A piece of news that surfaced early on, and the Warren Commission almost went to pieces trying to cover it up. His numbers surfaced when he said, in effect, look, fellas, I don't know what you're trying to do to me. I'm working for the FBI. I'm trying to find out what's going on, too. My number is S-179. That was part of the standard number for an FBI informant. Well, of course, that was squashed before anybody could even get a start on it. Dean Andrews, an attorney who for years handled cases for Clay Shaw, although we didn't know that at the moment. Andrews specialized in municipal court cases largely, and was also handling some papers for Lee Oswald with regard to getting citizenship for Marina. Bannister had made a call on the day after the assassination to Dallas, Texas, to Oswald's jail. Incredibly enough, Oswald was both receiving and making calls. Here's a man who just supposedly killed the president. But nevertheless, he'd say, Lee, is another call for you, and they'd bring him to the phone, and then whenever he wanted to make a call, he'd give the number to the jail, and the jail would make the call and bring him over and keep all those papers together. Andrews, as he told me when I questioned him, and then told the FBI and he told the Warren Commission, he received a call from a man he identified as Clay Bertrand asking him to represent Lee Oswald. He said something about him in the hospital. He was in Charity Hospital at the time. I don't know if I can, and let me think that over. And about the time he put down the receiver, about 25 FBI men hit the door because they were monitoring those lines. What happened to all the calls that Oswald made and received? I must have spent 50 hours digging them down. And the bottom line was that the jailer said, oh, he kept them religiously. But one day he came in, looked in his drawer, and they were all gone. He doesn't know what happened to them. That's how we learned that Dean Andrews had received such a call, but the name Clay Bertrand we weren't that familiar with. Going through the copies of the FBI interview of Oswald and copies of Dean Andrews' testimony, I observed how increasingly frightened he became when he was asked who Clay Bertrand was. As a matter of fact, the more he was asked about Clay Bertrand's identity, the more steadily Clay Bertrand shrunk, because he was 6'3" when Andrews first described him to the FBI, but by the time the Warren Commission asked him how tall Clay Bertrand was, he was only 5 feet tall. Well, usually that's a sign that the man is answering the questions isn't completely comfortable with his situation. He's trying to get out of it. Well, we knew that Andrews was lying, so after I had a long conversation with Andrews and told him, look, Dean, we went to law school together. You're a friend of mine. I like you. But let me make one thing clear. If you continue to lie to me like you did to the FBI and the Warren Commission, you're not just going to walk out. You're going to go in front of the grand jury, and if you lie to the grand jury, you're going to jail. Well, that's what happened, of course. And we convicted him of perjury in front of a jury. That was the first conviction in the Kennedy case. There was a conviction, unlike what people say. That was the first. First of all, it goes much higher than a tactical level. The president is not removed to change foreign policy just because a handful of people at a tactical level decide to do so. I think that you can safely say individuals such as J. Edgar Hoover were actively involved at the outset, because Hoover not only wanted to see Johnson in office, he lived across the street from him in Washington for 19 years, probably his closest friend, and he had become senile, frankly. In other words, it's fine to be against communism, and I am, everybody is probably, to a reasonable degree, but when you reach a point like J. Edgar Hoover, where you think every man who doesn't wear a hat and a handkerchief in his pocket is a communist, he became a very dangerous man. So I would put him as one of the people involved at the highest level. As to Johnson, there's an old adage in intelligence which is on a need-to-know basis. In other words, you don't give information, no matter how trustworthy they are, to people who don't need to know, because it saves a number of people you have to tell. Johnson was such a natural hawk that they knew they could change the policy back to the Cold War without telling him, so I suggest the likelihood that is on a need-to-know basis they didn't bother to tell him, because he was so totally corrupt they didn't have to tell him anyway. Allen Dulles is, without the slightest doubt, a major participant in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy and to change the foreign policy. Because the CIA was formed out of the OSS, special emphasis was given early on to the covert operations. But when Dulles took over, killing became a science in the CIA, something regularly done and accepted and done to Americans within America. Of all the corrupt things that Lyndon Johnson ever did, appointing Allen Dulles to sit on the Warren Commission and to find out who killed John Kennedy was very much like appointing Brutus to investigate the death of Julius Caesar to see who killed him. He knew exactly who killed him and how he was killed, and he knew he was going to be killed beforehand. I have no doubt about that. Earl Warren, I think he was fooled. They had structured in so many false sponsors, the mob and Castro, the oil barons. It was a beautifully done plan, and probably with the final approval of people at the Dulles level. But in the case of Warren, by getting him in, you stopped the liberals from coming in too deeply, and that was what was so cynical about the plan, but it was beautifully done. They'd also structured in the possibility of some kind of Russian response if there was going to be a sign of warfare. I can almost visualize Johnson, the man who would climb a tree to tell a lie, saying, "Chief, we need your help. The nation needs you now more than ever," and so forth. So they got an honest, well-intentioned man who wasn't, to say, the greatest intellectual in the world, and fooled him. People who were really running the thing like Allen Dulles. I can't pretend to have a magic globe, so I won't speculate. I found it clearly up to Bannister. I can see how he worked, but I don't pretend to have inside knowledge of that upper gap whereby it goes up to the top level. But I do think it had to go to some of the highest individuals of covert operations, because you're not merely changing foreign policy, you're removing a president of the United States to do it. I insist this country will not survive as a republic if the Congress and the presidency continue to fool the people about Jack Kennedy and continue to postpone telling them the truth. Our country will not survive.
Mr. Garrison in the film says it is just inconceivable to him that the mafia would have the organizational ability to bring an Oswald in and out of Russia, to get him a job in a book depository, to design the parade route or motorcade in such a way that it would bring Mr. Kennedy beneath the building in such a way. And beyond that, how would the mob cover up the autopsy and appoint the Warren Commission? Why anyone would, in 1967, seek to be a governor of a state by going against the CIA and the entire government suggesting they killed its president is beyond me. Jim's political life was over the moment he brought those charges. Obviously, he was taking on the establishment in a major way, and he paid a heavy price for it. He has been vilified and trashed over and over again in the press. He has now become a non-person in a sense that Stalin's opponents, Bukharov and Trotsky, became non-persons. There are no specifics that are ever brought up. It's been a media mantra, a buzzword. The journalists cite each other to substitute for critical analysis. Jim had an interesting history. He was an FBI man. He was a war hero. He was elected 3 times DA of New Orleans. Why? Not by the establishment, but because he was popular. He was unpopular in the press, in the Times-Picayune. He was unpopular with Clay Shaw's friends. He was unpopular with the establishment of New Orleans. But he was elected 3 times. And then he's since become an appellate judge in that city after the trial. He had a case. There were 2 evidentiary hearings. He went to a 3-judge panel, criminal judges. He presented his facts. Those 3 judges in 1967 said, go to trial. He went to a grand jury of 12 jurors. They said, go to trial. He had witnesses and he had evidence. 3 major witnesses, however, died before he could get to trial. Obviously, Oswald, Ruby is part of it, but we have Guy Bannister and we have David Ferry. These were key witnesses in the possible connection of Shaw, Bannister, and Ferry. Since the trial, we have found significant evidence that Shaw knew Oswald, not only through Perry Russo, but through the Clinton witnesses from Clinton, Louisiana. 10 people pointed to Shaw as being in Clinton that day with Lee Oswald at a core rally. Dean Andrews pointed to a man called Clay Bertrand, who Jim found out to be Clay Shaw. That testimony was thrown out of court by the judge in the scene that we show in the movie with the officer not being allowed to testify. The jury came back and said that Shaw was not guilty, but when they were polled after the trial, they said that Jim Garrison had convinced them that there had been a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, but they couldn't make the link to Clay Shaw. By the way, Jim Garrison did make his summation speech. Several people have said he did not. He did make that summation speech, and 80% of it is in the movie, in the scene. We added some from his Playboy interview, but essentially that is his speech and that is his summation. Judge Haggerty, who presided over the case and who, in a sense, hurt Jim's case by refusing to take the Clay Bertrand testimony, said after Clay Shaw died, he waited until Clay Shaw died in 73, he said in a television interview, "I do believe to this day that the jury should have found Clay Shaw guilty. I do not believe Clay Shaw told the truth at the trial." After the trial, we come in possession of a picture that shows Clay Shaw and David Ferrie were at a party together. Shaw perjured himself time and again at that trial, denying that he knew Oswald, denying that he knew Ferrie, and denying that he was a member of the CIA, which we find out that he was. Call him what you want, domestic contact, etc., etc. He has a history with the CIA. It was pointed out by Richard Helms. Finally, under oath, he told the truth. Victor Marchetti supports that theory, saying that during the trial, Mr. Helms was very concerned with the fate of Clay Shaw and offered all the help he could. In addition to that, we now know that Mr. Shaw was on the board of directors of Primindex, a fascist organization in Italy that was thrown out of Italy for illegal espionage activities. Among them, promoting financial transactions in the attempted assassination of Charles de Gaulle, the president of France. So I think we have a serious case that was brought and lost and failed, and that is as it is. But there is something more than meets the eye. I would liken Jim Garrison's case somewhat to the Lawrence Walsh case of the 1980s when he tried to bring that same covert arm of the government to the light of day, and he failed. Jim's subpoenas on Dulles, on Cabell, on Helms were all squashed by the Justice Department in Washington.
How my office happened to catch David Ferrie when he came back in from his weekend trip to Texas was because I was just doing my duty as a district attorney because the president had been killed. Lee Oswald had spent the summer in New Orleans, so we were pretty much, you might say, grabbing suspicious people. It just happens in hindsight. By accident, we grabbed people who were relevant, but we did not know that at the time. So that's why I promptly turned Ferrie over to the FBI. And for the next 3 years, I concentrated on burglaries, armed robberies, murders, and so forth. So don't give me too much credit. I did not see that something was wrong. I should have. It was apparent, but I didn't see it for 3 years. I plead guilty to believing the government's lie. And one of the reasons I believed it was I'd been in the Army all my life. 5 years in World War II, 18 years in the National Guard, and the Army had never deceived me or been deceptive, and the Army was the government to me. So I accepted these things without question. I put 6 years on something I could have done in 2. The reason I put 6 years on the trail of the assassinations was to make it irrefutable. So even someone who begins doubting my position of something will have to end up seeing what happened and what the government did. I cannot tell the people how to do this because I'm not a seer nor a prophet, but they must somehow communicate to two groups, the Congress and the Executive Department, that they will no longer take the lie. If they have to do like the Chinese students did and block the military from coming into the square, whatever they have to do, they have to tell the government, we will not take this lie anymore. Make this government the way it's supposed to be and stop telling us an unbelievable lie because we won't take it. I think I've made the point to the reasonable individual that elements of the covert operations, not the entire structure of the CIA, because John McCone, who was appointed by Jack Kennedy, I know cared for Jack Kennedy, but elements of the covert operations, which was the murder part of the CIA and consists even now of 2/3 of the CIA. You shouldn't have covert operations inside the United States against American citizens, but we do every day, and that's one of the things that has caused this country to cease being a democracy.
In 1960, you had 4 men who wanted desperately to be president. Richard Nixon was one, Lyndon Johnson was one, John F. Kennedy was one, or at least his daddy wanted it for him, and Hubert Humphrey was one. And they had an all-out struggle for the presidency. It is not coincidental that 3 of the 4 of them ultimately would become president of the United States. The Operation 40, which was the CIA mafia secret plot to kill Fidel Castro, greenlighted by Vice President Richard Nixon in the late 1950s. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, and the pardon are all interrelated events with the same exact cast of characters. This is not coincidental that 4 of the Watergate burglars arrested on June 17, 1972 were both on the ground in Dealey Plaza in 1963 and also at the Bay of Pigs. By 1973, Nixon is a man who has enemies both to his right and to his left. Nixon has no friends. He offends the left, of course, beginning in 1947 when he accuses Harvard-educated FDR legman Alger Hiss of being a communist spy. The mainstream media establishment rejects this idea because Hiss went to the right schools, he belongs to the right clubs, he has the right friends. It's not possible. Of course, we now know with the fall of the Soviet Union and our access to the KGB archives that Hiss was in fact a communist spy and a traitor. So Nixon wins the enmity of the left. They claim that he smeared Helen Cahagan Douglas, the congresswoman he ran against. Well, he knew that she was shacked up with Congressman Lyndon Johnson. This was well known, but he never used it in the campaign. She called him a peewee. She called him Tricky Dick. She was the one who first said that he voted an inordinate amount of time with the famous communist hardline congressman from Harlem, Vito Marcantonio. And then, of course, when Nixon's people ran the statistics, they found that she had voted more with Vito than Nixon had. Yeah, it was bare knuckles. A U.S. Senate seat was up for grabs. So Nixon, for example, was accused of calling her the Pink Lady. She's pink, folks, right down to her underwear. There's only one problem. Nixon never said that. That was said by Manchester Body, the publisher of the LA Daily News, who ran in the Democratic primary against Mrs. Douglas as a conservative Democrat. Nixon goes from the House of Representatives to the Vice Presidency of the United States in just 6 years. That's an extraordinarily meteoric climb. And he has the good fortune in his first race for Congress to run against Jerry Voorhees, who's a populist Democrat, but more importantly, a real critic of the Federal Reserve. So there's plenty of Wall Street money for Nixon's first campaign, most of it delivered by none other than Prescott Bush, father of George H.W. Bush, partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, which, by the way, is a bipartisan money-making operation because Averell Harriman is the leading liberal Democrat light of his day. Press Bush made most of his money selling arms to the Nazis. That was a big moneymaker for the Bush family. But he is among those who tells Eisenhower, you need ideological balance, a real anti-communist, youth to balance your age, you need California to balance the East Coast, because Eisenhower was in fact the candidate of the Wall Street Eastern elite, despite the fact he was himself from Kansas. So he recommended Richard Nixon, and that's how Nixon gets on the ticket. And it is why Nixon has a loyalty not to George H.W. Bush, his loyalty is to Prescott Bush, because Prescott Bush supported him for the vice presidency. The Central Intelligence Agency, Joint Chiefs, Army Intelligence, they think in Nixon they're getting the ultimate right-wing hardliner. They think he's going to unfetter them in Vietnam, which is really saying something if you look at the way Johnson has juiced up the war. To their shock and surprise, Nixon is for détente. Nixon wants to open the door to China. First of all, he wants to bring all of our troops home from Vietnam and end that expensive fiasco. Yeah, he ramps up the bombing, no question. But he does so as a cover for the removal of our troops, and he overrules his own defense secretary to remove the troops on a more accelerated basis than the Pentagon wants. Then he uses the back channel to the Chinese. That's because he doesn't want the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department to know that he wants to reach an rapprochement with the Chinese. And once he does that, he uses it to broker deep arms control agreements with the Soviets. As you might imagine, the military-industrial complex is furious. This isn't the Nixon they thought we elected. So Nixon has no friends on the left, and he has no friends on the right. He's by himself. The Central Intelligence Agency fostered at least 2 plots to try to assassinate Nixon over his détente policies. The first one was to take place in Key Biscayne, Florida, right outside a compound that Nixon had there, where the agency planned to infiltrate a Vietnam Veterans Against the War demonstration and use a shoulder-launched rocket to kill Nixon as he left his property. When that plot disintegrated, the Central Intelligence Agency authorized the hiring of a contract killer named Edwin Kaiser. Kaiser had killed for the agency before. He was supplied with a weapon, but he was not informed of his target until the last minute. When he learned that the target was the President of the United States, that he was to kill Nixon the way the agency had helped to kill Kennedy, he dropped out and the plot collapsed. Ultimately, though, the Central Intelligence Agency would play a key role in bringing Nixon down. They would infiltrate and sabotage the Watergate break-in. The idea that the Watergate break-in was politically necessary makes no sense. At the time of the break-in, Nixon was leading his opponent, George McGovern, a hapless left-winger, by 19 points on his way to a 49-state blowout. Nixon was on his way to the greatest mandate in American politics other than that won by Franklin Roosevelt. One book by John W. Dean called The Nixon Defense tells us that he has written the definitive book on Watergate. Yet he's airbrushed himself completely out the narrative as if he wasn't even there. But he says in the book, if you want to know what role I played, you should read my book, Blind Ambition. But when confronted under oath about discrepancies between that book, Blind Ambition, and his sworn testimony, he said, well, I didn't write Blind Ambition. That was written by my ghostwriter, Taylor Branch. I spoke to Mr. Branch. He says that's a lie. Then he said in a further deposition under oath, no, I didn't write this. this book. It was written by Alice Mayhew, my editor at Random House. Funny, he says John Dean's a liar, and that's a lie. Dean tells us that this book is based on 362 new transcripts of tapes between Nixon and his aides that have never before been made public. Well, folks, they still haven't been made public because Mr. Dean claims the book is based on them, but he won't release those transcripts so that a third party, a peer or a historian or someone independent, could look at them to see if they are accurate. He doesn't mention his conversations with Nixon on March 13th, 16th, 17th, or 20th as if they didn't exist. You can listen to those tapes online. What you'll hear is John Dean sucking Nixon into the cover-up. You'll hear Nixon's lawyer urging him to commit crimes. Watergate burglar James McCord tells the grand jury that John Dean knew about the Watergate in advance. Jeb Magruder says in a deposition under oath that Dean is the one who pushed him to push Gordon Liddy to take a burglar team into the Watergate. What is it that Dean is looking for? Dean is interested in the records of a call girl ring that's located just a few blocks from the Watergate that the Democrats are using to set up assignations for big deal Democrats who come to town and want a night on the town. John Dean is specifically interested in a portfolio that has pictures of the various ladies of the night that you can rent. Why? Because his wife's picture is in the portfolio. That is what Watergate is about. In fact, one of the Watergate burglars, Eugenio Martinez, 92 years old, I have interviewed him. He was arrested with the key to the desk drawer where the portfolio of the ladies was kept. Dean either wants that information for the purposes of political blackmail or because he knows it compromised him because of his wife's role. 15 years ago, an author named Len Kolodny began to write a book about Watergate. He had a taped interview with all of the principals in the Watergate drama. Gordon Liddy, John Mitchell, Chuck Colson, each one of the Watergate burglars. It was meant to be a scholarly work. And among those he interviewed was John Dean. And Dean has sought since that time to suppress that interview in any way possible. He sued Kolodny. It was a 15-year, $8 million litigation. That was unsuccessful. It ended up settling out of court. There's no bar against Kolodny continuing to sell his book or to tell his story. But then these tapes were given to Florida State University where they would be made available to scholars or anyone else who wanted to listen to them. Dean threatened to sue the university. Dean went to the state's attorney in that county and tried to get Kolodny prosecuted, saying that he had been taped without his knowledge, although if you listen to the tape, the very first thing out of Len Kolodny's mouth is, "Mr. Dean, I'm taping this. Does that have your approval?" And Dean says, "Yes, that's fine." So that went out the window. Here's the good news. These tapes have just been accepted by Texas A&M. They will be publicly available online. Nixon never approves the break-in because there's no good reason to have the break-in. He is politically on his way to his greatest political triumph. He also has a plan to completely reorganize the American government. He's going to streamline government. He's going to cut the size and cost of government, and that scares the daylights out of the permanent government in place. So the Watergate burglary is infiltrated and sabotaged, largely by the Central Intelligence Agency. And then sadly, from that point on, Nixon completely mishandles it. He joins the cover-up. There is no question about that. What he should have done was to fire all of those he believed were involved, but the problem is nobody will give him a direct answer about who is involved, and everybody in his circle points to everybody else. Was it Mitchell, Colson, Haldeman, Ehrlichman? We still don't know the answer to that. Everybody points to someone else. No one ever squares with Nixon. He goes to his grave not knowing who approved Watergate and why, but it gives the Central Intelligence Agency and the political establishment the opportunity they need at the 1972 ballot box to get rid of Nixon, and more importantly, to get rid of a détente. General Alexander Haig begins as Henry Kissinger's deputy in the White House, is in charge of the oversight of wiretaps in 1969 of certain reporters and government officials suspected of leaking foreign policy secrets. Those wiretaps are highly confidential. They're one of the deep secrets of the Nixon administration. But more importantly, the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex is so concerned about Nixon's lurch to the left that they start spying on him immediately in 1969. Spying defined as a naval yeoman named Radford is going through the burn bags, through the files, through desks, even goes through Kissinger's briefcase, copying top-secret foreign policy memos, and he's sending them directly to the Joint Chiefs. They go directly to Admiral Thomas Moorer, who is a wild-eyed anti-communist hardliner. But before they get to Moorer, they make a stop at the desk of General Alexander Haig. Haig is supervising the spying on his own boss for his masters at the Pentagon. Haig's loyalty is never to Nixon. It is to the neocons who see war as being profitable and good for them, but not good for America. Haig takes a number of steps that undermine Nixon when he's embattled in White House and really walk him towards the exit. The most important one, of course, is the famous tapes. Nixon is taping his conversations as president. By the way, John Kennedy taped his conversations, so did Lyndon Johnson. The difference is those presidents knew when to turn the tape recorder off. Nixon's taping system is voice activated, and therefore it catches him joining the cover-up, directing the cover-up. It's the beginning of the end. Now, some ask about the famous 18.5-minute gap, and this is where Al Haig really comes into play. Nixon believes that his White House taping system is a secret that will never be revealed. Haig tips off Bob Woodward of the Washington Post that the system exists and that there is a tape on the 23rd of March in which there is a, quote, deliberate erasure. Well, if you go listen to that tape, there's not one erasure, there's three. First, there's a 5-minute gap. There's a loud hum, probably caused by a wall socket or some other electrical interference. That was very definitely done by Nixon's personal secretary, Rose Woods, and it really is an error. It's a mistake. She goes right to Nixon's lawyers immediately and says, I've made a terrible mistake. They tell her, don't worry about it. It's not on a tape that's been subpoenaed. That is, by the way, wrong. And then there's 2 additional gaps where you don't hear a loud hum, and they together total another 13.5 for a grand total of 18.5 minutes. Those erasures happen while the tapes are in the custody of General Alexander Haig, who then makes the erasures and tips off the Washington Post through Bob Woodward, who has a military career which he has completely hidden and has a long association with Haig. And of course, it is the act of the tape erasure that causes the firestorm that brings Nixon down. Now, Haig learns on a Friday that the Senate Watergate Committee has learned about the tape and the erasure. Well, of course, he knows. He's the one who told Woodward, who told the Senate Committee. But he doesn't tell Nixon on Saturday or Sunday. Nixon can legally destroy the tapes on the weekend because they are his property and they have not yet been subpoenaed. But Haig never gives Nixon the heads up. Nixon learns about the tapes being public on Monday morning by watching television just like everyone else. We also know that in order to try to dispel Watergate once and for all, Nixon agreed to the appointment of a Watergate special prosecutor. Incredibly, Elliot Richardson, the liberal Republican who's Attorney General, appoints Archibald Cox, who'd been Solicitor General of the United States under the Kennedys. Cox is demanding access to the tapes. Nixon's insisting the tapes are his personal property and he has no obligation to turn them over, which, by the way, the courts had always held right up until 1972, that all tapes, papers, records, binders were the property of the president. It isn't until Nixon that the courts reversed themselves. So Nixon decides to fire Cox, and he sends Al Haig, his chief of staff at that time, to go talk to Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, to ascertain what Richardson will do in the event that Nixon decides to fire Cox. And Haig reports to Nixon, don't have to worry, Richardson will stick. That's not what Richardson said. Richardson said, if you give an order to fire Cox, I will have to quit. So Haig misleads Nixon. Nixon gives the order to fire Cox. That firestorm on top of the 18.5 of the minutes is the beginning of the end. Nixon falls. That's strike 2 for Al Haig. To the extent that there is a deep throat, Al Haig is deep throat. So there is no deep throat. A deal is made on August 1st, 1974. Nixon will resign only after he has a guarantee from Gerald Ford that he will be pardoned. And indeed, Nixon ultimately resigns on August 9th, 1974. Nixon's resignation took effect at midnight on the 9th while he was on a jet halfway between Washington and California. So he left Washington as president and he landed in California as a former president. How did that come about? Well, first of all, they had to get Spiro Agnew out of the way. Agnew was a man who would not pardon Nixon. So they essentially hoke up charges of corruption against him. He ultimately pleads to a very minor tax charge. He writes in his own book that he was set up. Al Haig comes to him and basically says, go quietly or else. Agnew writes, or else? What, they'll make it look like a car accident? Or maybe a heart attack? Or maybe they'll just shoot me, he writes, the way they did John Kennedy. But Agnew is muscled out of the way. And knowing that he can't survive a trial in a government controlled by his enemies, he resigns. This sets the stage for the appointment of Gerald Ford, because Gerald Ford is a man on whom Nixon has leverage. In 1963, Congressman Gerald Ford, as a member of the Warren Commission, is personally responsible for the alteration in the autopsy of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In his own hand, Gerald Ford changes the description of the wound in Kennedy's upper back and moves it to his lower neck in order to accommodate the government's fraudulent single bullet theory. How do we know this? In 1987, the Kennedy autopsy is declassified. It's made public, and it's Ford's handwriting, in pencil, by the way. The New York Times reports it. Associated Press reports it. The New York Times asks Ford, then a former president, why did you do this? Why did you change the autopsy? Ford says, well, the country needed clarity. You notice he didn't say the country needed truth. So, Richard Nixon said if he was going down, he was taking everyone with him. It is correct that he didn't really want the pardon, because with the pardon came the implication that he was accepting guilt, and he never believed that he was guilty. He survives with a pardon and ironically emerged as a key foreign policy advisor to President William Jefferson Clinton at the time of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The Johnson sisters unloaded an ungodly amount of gold in the United States on the international market in the late 1980s. The idea of Nixon taking a key to the gate where the gold was held directly and not having a middleman in between himself and some guard is highly improbable. Johnson actually has the gold trucked to an airstrip in Mexico and then flown to the LBJ ranch, ultimately sends it to Vancouver where it's smelted and his daughters ultimately unloaded. Hillary has a deep-seated and long-time animus towards Nixon because she is a member of the staff of the House Impeachment Committee. And she writes a memo arguing that if Nixon is impeached, he isn't entitled to legal counsel, which is wrong. But she ultimately gets fired from that position for leaking and lying. Fast forward to 1993, Nixon has a strong desire to meet Clinton. The Bushes never treat Nixon particularly well when George H.W. Bush is president, which is strange in view of the fact that Nixon props up his career with these appointive jobs once he demonstrates here in Texas twice that he's incapable of winning a statewide election. And he ultimately parlays that into becoming president of the United States. So I was empowered to reach out to Clinton through third parties. I went to my old boss, Senator Bob Dole. We went to Robert Strauss, who was a special trade representative under Carter and Democratic National Chairman. They both sat with Clinton and said, you really ought to have Nixon in here. You ought to invite him in, hear what he has to say. He's just come back from the Soviet Union, traveling extensively in China and in Russia in his late 80s. And it'd be beneficial for you. It'd be beneficial for the country. I think you'd benefit from his counsel. And Clinton reacts very favorably every time the idea is brought up to him. James Carville, Paul Begala, Senator Dole, Strauss, they all carry back positive comments. Yes, it's going to happen. Months go by and nothing happens. Finally, I went to the Clinton advisor, Dick Morris, and he says, well, let me check into it and see what the problem is. And he finds out that these meetings have all been spiked by Hillary. So he finally goes to Clinton. He says, look, you got to overrule your wife and get Nixon in here. If for no other reason, you're buying yourself immunity from criticism. Even if you reject his results, he can't go out and denounce you. He can't criticize you. So Clinton overrules Hillary. He invites Nixon. Nixon and Bill Clinton hit it off. Maybe it's that they're both poor, that they're both liars. They both had great political comebacks. Maybe it's that they're just intense political animals with an ambition for political office. But on his way out of the White House, he meets Hillary very briefly. So he called me almost immediately after he left. I said, well, Mr. President, how did it go? He said, oh, it went great. Clinton, he's much smarter than you think. He's much smarter than I thought. I was very impressed. I said, what about her, Mr. President? What do you think of Hillary? He said, she's cold as ice. And that from the coldest man of all time. The conservatives around Reagan, the original Reaganites, overwhelmingly favored Jack Kemp from California, the upstate congressman, who was more in line with Reagan's own political philosophy. Henry Kissinger was the progenitor of the idea of taking Gerald Ford. And for a good 24 hours, the moderate Republicans launched a major effort to convince Reagan that the only way he could win would be taking Ford. And then Ford, Kissinger, and Reagan sat down and they began talking about a co-presidency. And that was enough for Reagan. He was not going to be co-president with Gerald Ford. That wasn't happening. At that juncture, Bob Teeter, Michael Deaver, with the acquiescence of Ed Meese, persuaded Reagan that he needed suburban, moderate Republican votes, and the only guy who could bring them was Bush. He was talked into it, and of course, that had the effect of breathing life back into George Bush's presidential aspirations, and the rest is, as they say, history. Once Reagan becomes president, Bush begins plotting against Reagan immediately. George Bush says on Iran-Contra he was out of the loop. Out of the loop? Everybody involved are his people. It's a setup. This is a coup d'etat. He wants to take Reagan down the same way that they took Nixon down. It's an inside job.